More than a century later, the Titanic still holds areas that time has never fully revealed. On the floor of the Atlantic, corridors, structures, and inner passageways remain as silent traces of a tragedy cut short. Among those spaces, there is a door in a little explored section that stands out, not because of what it has already shown, but because of what still remains inaccessible. And when a detail like that survives for so long, it stops being just part of the ship and becomes something else entirely. A question that still refuses to go away.
Today, we're heading to the Titanic, door no one should open. Stay with us.
Titanic rests nearly 13,000 feet below the surface, in a region where natural light never reaches, and the pressure turns every expedition into an extreme test of precision. In that environment, the ship is no longer just a historic symbol. It has become a fragile, silent underwater archaeological site. The bow still commands respect, but every visible detail is now surrounded by corrosion, collapse, and the slow loss of material. What has been recorded there shows that the wreck did not vanish completely. It still preserves volumes, passageways, and surfaces that help reconstruct what happened. But the closer we get, the clearer it becomes. Titanic is still far from being a closed case. Since the wreck was discovered in 1985, expedition after expedition has documented the ship with increasingly precise methods. Submersibles and remote cameras made it possible to examine exterior sections, interior corridors, and objects that stayed in place for decades. These images are not just impressive to look at. They help historians and researchers understand the ship's structure, its condition, and the real limits of access. Have you ever felt that chill when you realize an image is showing more than ruin, that it is showing frozen time? On Titanic, every technical breakthrough revealed more of the environment, but it also made one thing obvious: so much of it still remains out of reach. Before the disaster, Titanic operated like a complex machine, organized through decks, corridors, cabins, service areas, and technical sections, all connected by a strict internal logic. There were elegant circulation spaces for passengers, and at the same time, discrete passageways used by the crew to keep the ship running. Understanding that anatomy matters because an isolated door is never just a door. It depends on the purpose of the corridor, the compartment beside it, and the route that section once served. On a ship of this scale, small areas could hold critical functions or simply disappear from public memory because they were far from the best-known spaces. And it is exactly in those forgotten zones that this investigation begins to take shape. On the night of April 14, 1912, life on board still carried the appearance of normalcy. The bridge operated by the standards of the time, the corridors maintained their regular flow, and the ship moved across relatively calm seas under bitter cold and limited visibility over the dark surface. For most people inside, nothing suggested that the voyage was about to change forever. That moment matters because it shows Titanic before the break, a functional, disciplined, and seemingly stable system. And it is from that organized state that, just minutes later, the disorder would emerge that explains why certain sections were sealed off forever. The encounter with the iceberg did not happen the way many people imagine. It was not a head-on crash. The damage came from a glancing scrape along the starboard side that opened sections below the waterline. Outside, it happened fast. Inside, the first signs were subtle, almost deceptive. For many passengers, the initial sensation was little more than an unusual shudder, nothing that immediately suggested the seriousness of the situation. But on a ship that large, only a few minutes were enough to turn invisible damage into a structural crisis. And that is where the story truly begins to tighten its grip. The first signs of flooding appeared far from the grand rooms in the visible rhythm of the voyage. In technical compartments near the bow, water began entering spaces that depended on minutes, not hours, to change conditions completely. The most important detail here is that, at first glance, the problem did not look cinematic. It looked operational. Internal doors were closed, passageways began to be isolated, and the crew had to decide what could still be contained. And it is precisely in those lesser-seen corridors that the story begins to leave marks that are hard to erase. When the technical team assessed the extent of the damage, it became clear that the breach was not confined to a single point in the hull. Water was advancing through successive sections of the bow, disrupting the ship's internal logic and reducing the time available for any effective response. On an ocean liner of this scale, the structure was designed to compartmentalize risk, but not to overcome such an unfavorable chain of openings below the waterline. You can almost feel the weight of that turning point. To anyone looking from the outside, the ship still seemed intact, but inside, it had already begun losing the battle. And once that happens, even an ordinary corridor takes on historic significance. The evacuation began while much of the interior still looked normal. Passengers were directed upward. The crew tried to preserve order, and many once crowded spaces began emptying far too quickly. That contrast matters. On deck, urgency kept rising. Inside the ship, entire corridors were being left behind. Little by little, the main flow of movement shifted toward staircases, exits, and boat deck embarkation areas, leaving some sections of the bow increasingly secondary. That is the moment Titanic stops being just a famous setting and becomes a historical labyrinth. As human traffic concentrated along the evacuation routes, certain inner passageways lost their function and were cut off earlier than others. In lesser-known areas of the bow, doors remained shut, corridors were blocked, and some sections became unreachable in the early stages of the crisis. The striking part is that these spaces rarely appear in the popular imagination, even though they may help explain how the ship was abandoned layer by layer. Do you see how the mystery becomes stronger when it grows out of real architecture, not invention? It is in that kind of space that our door begins to gain real weight. Now the investigation reaches the center of the story, a door in a little explored interior area, located in a section that may have been isolated too early to leave behind clear records. Its value is not in promising some impossible revelation, but in showing a real boundary between what has been observed and what remains out of reach. There may be nothing spectacular behind it, and that is exactly why the question becomes more serious. Because honestly, sometimes what holds our attention is not shock. It is a well-built doubt. So go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel, because from this point on, we are going to treat that door the way it deserves to be treated. With curiosity, but without forcing an answer that history itself may have chosen to preserve. That door matters because it does not exist in isolation. It is part of an internal network of movement, service, and access between sectors of the ship. Depending on its exact position in the bow, a barrier like that could help explain crew flow, the abandonment of compartments, or simply the accidental preservation of a space that fell outside the main routes. What draws attention is not just the physical object, but the context around it. A narrow corridor, functional architecture, proximity to technical areas, and signs of interruption. In archaeology, a small detail can reorganize an entire interpretation. And on Titanic, few details speak as clearly as what still remains shut. What could exist behind that door? The most honest answer is this. Several plausible possibilities, and none of them need to be exaggerated. It could be a service compartment that already collapsed, a common space with objects never documented, or simply an area distorted by the violence of the disaster and the decades of deterioration on the ocean floor. The central point is not to sell fantasy, but to recognize that the lack of access preserves doubt as part of the evidence. And maybe that is what makes it even more powerful. More than a century later, there are still sections of Titanic that keep speaking precisely because no one has opened them. From here on, the problem stops being merely technical and becomes archaeological. Titanic is still degrading on the floor of the Atlantic, and every surface near that door sends the same message. Touching it could cost more than it reveals. Corrosion, interior collapse, and accumulated sediment have turned that corridor into a fragile reading space, where even approaching it has to be calculated with extreme care. It is no exaggeration to say that in some places, the structure survives more through balance than strength. And when the evidence is that delicate, preservation becomes an active choice. To understand why that door carries so much weight, it helps to return for a moment to the night of 1912. What now looks like just a dark corridor was once part of a functional circulation space, with simple doors, practical passageways, and sectors working far from the ship's best-remembered areas. As water advanced through the bow, those spaces began to change meaning. They stopped being routes and became limits. Do you notice how the mystery grows stronger when the place was once ordinary, before becoming unreachable? That parallel between the living corridor of 1912 and the ruin we see today is what sets up the strongest point of the investigation. We have reached the point where the camera can go almost all the way but no farther. The closeness reveals metalwork, texture, distortion, sediment, enough detail to make one thing clear. That door still exists as both a physical and historical boundary. But the most important part is not what the lens shows. It is what the lens refuses to force. Because at that moment, the question stops being simply, what is behind it, and becomes something far more uncomfortable. Is it worth putting the wreck itself at risk just to satisfy curiosity? And it is exactly that restraint that turns the silence of the scene into the peak of tension. After reaching the closest possible approach, the most serious decision is to back away. Instead of pushing further, documentary exploration works through distance, observation, and contextual reading, because forcing a way through could destroy the very thing we are trying to understand. There is something deeply human in that, isn't there? Knowing the technology can get close and still accepting the limit. On Titanic, that choice does not weaken the investigation. It gives it credibility. What remains closed still matters as evidence, precisely because it has not been violated. Even without opening certain areas, Titanic expeditions have already recorded objects that help reconstruct daily life and the ship's final hours. Dishes, suitcases, personal belongings, instruments, and small material traces show that history does not depend only on large spaces, but also on what was left scattered, preserved, or displaced by the disaster. These items gain meaning not because of their isolated value, but because of where they were found and the section to which they belonged. It is almost like building a narrative from remnants that never expected to survive. And that reinforces a central idea. The wreck already says a great deal, even without opening every door. This is where the investigation matures. Titanic does not reveal its secrets only through direct access, but through pattern, architecture, signs of use, distortions, and objects left behind along the way. A partially preserved corridor, a line of doors, an unusual accumulation of debris. All of that can say a great deal to anyone who knows how to read a historical scene with care. In other words, the ship continues to produce answers, even when it denies entry. And maybe that is the documentary's strongest turn. The door matters less as a promise of being opened and more as proof that real limits still exist inside one of the most studied shipwrecks in the world. In the final phase of the sinking, the ship's internal logic had changed completely. The bow was plunging lower and lower, the decks were losing balance, and what still seemed organized was beginning to give way under gravity and the steady influx of water. The most striking part is that from certain angles, some sections still looked functional for a few brief seconds, far too brief to mean safety. But the structure was already doomed, and every abandoned corridor became a silent record of that collapse. It is from that process that the interrupted areas were born, the same areas that still raise questions today. Once the bow had pulled the ship into an extreme angle, the central structure began bearing a load it could not sustain for long. The break does not represent only Titanic's physical end on the surface. It also explains why so many interior areas reached the seafloor in such different conditions from one another. Some sections preserved recognizable volume, others were deformed or destroyed violently. And that matters enormously for our subject, because any surviving door or corridor also carries the memory of that brutal strain. In a case like this, the structure is not just background, it is part of the evidence. After the breakup, the stern remained for a few moments like an almost unreal image in the darkness of the Atlantic. But that balance did not last. The aft section lost support, began its final descent, and disappeared beneath the surface, ending the ship's visible presence at sea. It sends a chill through you to think about it, because from that point on, the entire story continued without a direct witness, on the floor of the ocean. And it is exactly in that place, without light, without voice, and without easy return, that Titanic began preserving the traces we now try to interpret. On the floor of the Atlantic, Titanic stopped being just a famous wreck and became a historical site on a monumental scale. The bow and stern lie separated, surrounded by a vast debris field, corrosion, and almost absolute physical silence. Over time, bacteria, pressure, collapse, and chemical decay began erasing part of what still remained. That is why every new observation carries a double weight. It reveals more, and at the same time reminds us that the ship is slowly disappearing. Preserving that balance is one of the keys to understanding why certain areas remain untouched. When we return to the door after tracing the wreck as a whole, it no longer functions like rumor or an isolated object. Now it appears as evidence, a physical boundary inside a real architecture, in an area consistent with the ship's internal history, and with the way certain passageways became inaccessible. Its value is not in promising some spectacular revelation, but in condensing everything Titanic still resists giving away. And that changes the way we look at it. The question stops being childish and becomes historical. What does that door represent within the ship that sank, and within the wreck that survived? Today's technology allows us to get closer to Titanic than any previous generation could have imagined. More sensitive cameras, detailed mapping, and remote operations can record texture, position, and context with astonishing precision. But that progress comes with an obligation. Not everything that can be reached should be touched. There is a very fine line between investigating and erasing, between discovering and destroying the evidence itself. On Titanic, respecting that line does not reduce the documentary. On the contrary, it gives it the seriousness a place like this demands, and maybe that is one of the strongest points of the whole story, the maturity to know when to stop. In the end, the door does not need to be opened to fulfill its role in the story. It captures what still makes Titanic a living case, a shipwreck studied in extraordinary detail, yet not completely exhausted. What it preserves could be an ordinary compartment, a destroyed void, or a small group of clues never documented. But at this point, that is no longer the most important thing.
This video was a historical reconstruction with AI, based on records from the period, created for educational and narrative purposes.
What matters is that the limit itself has become part of the meaning. And maybe that is exactly where the mystery gains its greatest strength, because the absence of an answer begins to say as much as any discovery ever could. More than 113 years later, Titanic remains in the dark, under crushing pressure, losing material, and still generating new questions. Among them is the question of a forgotten door in a little explored area of the bow, not because anyone proved some final secret behind it, but because everything around it suggests interruption, isolation, and frozen time. In one of the most analyzed shipwrecks in history, there are still sections that survive precisely because they have not been forced open. And maybe that is the last image that truly matters. Not total discovery, but a boundary the ocean still keeps.